My name is Joyce, and this channel is Medusa Was Found. You can find more of my work at unguruyourlife.com. A private business club, research team, and lifestyle ensemble. Hi, welcome. This is Joyce. Thank you for joining me here at Medusa Was Framed. Today, I'm excited to share with you a topic that I stumbled upon through a connection with an earlier video, that of the Carrere and Hastings architects, the gentlemen who are noted for building the New York Public Library, but on a more local level are the men who are, we too are to believe, responsible for building Henry Flagler's St. Augustine Empire. That led me into this, the Pan American Exhibition of 1901 in Buffalo, New York. So let's get started. So the Pan, as it was referred to, ran from May to November of 1901. One of many World's Fair type events going on globally at the time, perhaps most notoriously noted as the location for President McKinley's assassination. It sat on the western edge of what is now Delaware Park, the boundaries being Elmwood Street on the west, Delaware on the east, Hoyt Lake on the south, and Railway on the north. Now, this region is referred to as Nottingham Terrace. Construction began in November of 1899 and was completed May 5, 1901, just one day before the fair opened. The organization behind the fair started in 1897 when the Pan American Exhibition Company was created. The general director of the fair was William L. Buchanan, a man known at the time as the Diplomat of the Americas. He was chosen for his diplomatic career of 15 years in securing a relationship with Central and South America, particularly Chile and Argentina. This fair, the Pan American, was to highlight that collaboration, the ending of the Spanish-American War that resulted in our securing Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Mr. Buchanan's greatest asset from his career was noticed as the securing of Panama. He continued in his diplomatic role under Teddy Roosevelt, who took over for President McKinley after the assassination. Mr. Buchanan was also the overseer of operations at the White City, the Columbia exhibition in Chicago years earlier. Also another fair in Sioux City, Iowa, and in South Dakota. He was selected at primary recommendation from fair president John G. Milburn. Milburn was a New York City lawyer as well as Buffalo lawyer. He was the president of the New York City Bar, the president of the Buffalo Club, and trustee of the Erie County Council. He was a staunch Democrat. His home housed and honored guest President McKinley, which is also where McKinley died. Morbidly, that house became a tourist attraction after the death until it was demolished in the 50s. The mayor of Buffalo at the time, Conrad Deal, was also a part of this committee. The building committee supervisor was Harry Hamlin. Now that name might seem familiar to some people. People of a certain age, of my age, remember an actor by the name of Harry Hamlin, whose most notable role was that from Clash of the Titans. In fact, he is the great-grandfather of actor Harry Hamlin. He was the father of Chauncey Jerome Hamlin, who was the founder of the Buffalo Museum of Science, and the often noticed grandfather and most noted ancestor of actor Harry Hamlin. This Harry Hamlin, from the committee, was a millionaire horse breeder who died in an auto accident in 1907. I will just say that more than one person on the board of directors from the Buffalo exhibition died shortly after in automobile accidents. Mr. Hamlin was married to Kate Louise Hamlin, who was the president of the Committee of Women Managers, who also held a seat on the board of directors and planning committee. The director of concessions was a Frederick Taylor, who hoped to profit $2 million following reports from the White City concession profits. The director of sculptor was Carl Bitters, an artist, sculptor in Hoboken, New Jersey, who went on to hire 100 workers to produce and reproduce casts in his studio, which were then transported by a train. Many casts were made and sold after the fair, profiting from his work and simply recasting them. There were over 500 statues. Mr. Cy Turner was a director of color, and this is important because whereas the Chicago Columbia exhibition was known as the White City, this was known as the Rainbow City. It was the Rainbow City by day and the City of Light by night, made evidenced by Edison, who filmed the fair during the day and again at night under the magnificent lights illuminated from the hydroelectric power at the nearby Niagara Falls. Now here is the connection where I came into this, though I certainly knew there had been a World's Fair in Buffalo. It was the connection here that drew me in and ultimately resulted in the video you're listening to now. The director of the Board of Architects was John Carrere of Carrere and Hastings. E.B. Green of Buffalo, George Shepley of Buffalo, George Carey of Buffalo, Auguste Eisenfolt of Buffalo, and John G. Howard of New York City were all a part of the Board of Architects. The original location set for this exhibition was Cayuga Island in the Niagara River for its proximity to the falls. The Spanish-American War broke out and created a hitch in this plan. When stabilized, a battle erupted between the cities of Niagara and Buffalo for the fair location. Buffalo won due to two primary factors. It was the 8th largest city in the nation at the time, and its railroad connectivity. More than one rail ran into Buffalo. It was a day's journey for, we are told, 40 million Americans. Having discussed this with my good friend Andrew Zabrun III on his show the other night, I feel the need to stress to anyone familiar with the area here that we are not talking about Cayuga Creek Cayuga Creek was not the planned location, but Cayuga Island, which Andrew, who lives in Erie County, lives in the area and knows Buffalo quite well, says is no longer called Cayuga Island. I don't recall what he said it's called. Grand Island, perhaps? That makes me think of Louisiana. But in any case, Cayuga Island is not to be confused with Cayuga Creek, which Andrew indicates runs right through where the fair originally was. 350 acres are what the Pan American occupied at a cost of $10 million. The location chosen was land owned by the Rumsey family, city elite. Part of the agreement for the land use included return of the property immediately after demolition to the Rumsey family for their own use, assuring, yes, demolition. Or is that just all part of the reset plan? July of 1898, Congress pledged $500,000 of money at the time to this project. Let's discuss the buildings. The Agricultural, Manufacturers, and Liberal Arts Building are said to be designed by the architect George Shepley. Shepley was a successor to the ultimate reset architect of them all, Henry Hobson Richardson, the prideful boy from New Orleans. Shepley took his place in the company that Hobson was with originally, making Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. In the Agricultural, Manufacturers, and Liberal Arts Building, the most notable exhibition, without question, would be, and now I want to say, I am using words that are written, the Negro Exhibit, which was organized by W.E.D. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, and Booker T. Washington, after their success at a similar exhibition at the Paris exhibition 2 years prior. They were incredibly well received, supported, and even written about for the value and historical significance of their exhibition. It was no secret of their plans for this fair once they were organized and acknowledged by financial support from Congress. The plans were fairly available, apparently, and Mr. Du Bois, Douglas, and Washington learned that the Negro exhibitions that were planned at the fair included the Old Plantation and Darkest Africa, neither of which, of course, represented Black folk in very favorable light. The Buffalo Black community started organizing via the Phyllis Wheatley Club. This was a group of women's African American clubs that had started in Nashville in 1895, helping with desegregation and voting rights. And apparently, there are still Phyllis Wheatley clubs active today. Miss Wheatley is responsible for the first publicly published book of poetry by a Black individual. She was born in West Africa, sold into slavery between the ages of 7 or 10. Of course, we can't determine that exactly. She was purchased by the Wheatley family for housework and apparently learned to read and write. And her application of reading and writing apparently was quite alliterative, so she was educated further and encouraged to be creative. There was a trip to London for one of the sons of the Wheatley family that she was asked to join in her service to the family, but also to take her writings to London. Apparently, the Wheatleys had written ahead to certain publishing houses in London where ideas of races were different, paving the way for her. So during this trip of 1773 in London, which was a very different place than 1773 in America, her book of poems was looked at and somehow published. Story goes that with the publication of her book, she received emancipation from the Wheatley family, married, bore children, and passed away during the birth of one at the young age of 31. There was a notable pamphlet at the time read at the Buffalo Wheatley Club, as well as the Michigan Street Baptist Church. I do not know if the Michigan Street Baptist Church is extant. I did not check. Andrew will correct me on this, if it exists or not. This pamphlet was called Why the American Negro Should Be Represented at the Pan American Exhibition. This struck a chord. This lit a fire under the African American community in Buffalo at the time. And they started negotiating with the help of Du Bois and Washington with the board of directors for the fair. Eventually, they were approved. In 4 months, materials poured in from Atlanta University, Fisk University, Howard University, Hampton, and Tuskegee universities, gathering photos, charts, pamphlets, and histories. This group was paired with Black lawyer Thomas Calloway and Library of Congress Assistant Librarian Daniel Murray, accessing resources through their touch as well, building a representation of literary, social, and scientific achievements with statistics and demonstratives about the daily lives of various African Americans in different walks of life. Hundreds of photographs, portraits of individuals from all walks of life, images of homes of prominent individuals in the Black community, the grounds of Black universities, various storefronts, and Black churches, a culmination of literary works by Black authors, and assorted Black accomplishments, including patents and medals of honor, along with 400 pages of Black codes from all states. Pulitzer Award-winning author David Levering, in his publication, A Small Nation of People, wrote of the Paris Negro Exhibition, quote, "The Negro Exhibit at Paris was a racial imperative, a momentous opportunity, and obligation to set the white world straight about Black people." Sadly, the acceptance in Buffalo overall was not quite to the standard of the Parisienne or even of Mr. Levering. Charles R. Hart was credited with creating the official catalog and guide of the park. There is no mention of the Negro Exhibit in the Agricultural Building. The New York Times repeatedly panned the exhibition as trash and not worth anyone's time. And yet, this exhibit became a hallmark. And there were other Negro exhibits following this fair as a result. Architect George Shepley, man attributed, reset architect, with the building of the Agricultural Building, was a successor to Henry Hobson Richardson, who, oh my gosh, married Richardson's daughter and had 5 children. Remember what I said about people dying soon after the fair? Mr. Shepley died in 1903 after moving to Switzerland for his health. The center of the fair, both geographically and emotionally, was the 13-story tall electric tower, the most popular attraction. 395 feet tall, illuminated by 44,000 electric lights, powered by the hydraulic generation of Niagara Falls. The illumination from the electric tower is noted to have been seen in Toronto and was a predominant place where Edison filmed both day and night. Thanking the Niagara Power Company for this and all of the electricity in the park. We are to believe that this Tartarian wonder was constructed by John Galen Howard. On top of the tower was an 18-foot tall angel known as Goddess of Light, the hallmark of all of Carl Bitter's sculpture work. Mr. Howard was born in Missouri, but made his name in California. He is noted for being the man who designed University of California at Berkeley. But anyone who knows anything about the Bay Area is familiar with Wheeler Hall, Memorial Stadium, and Sather Gate. All of these and more. Mr. Howard from Missouri is supposed to have built, along with the most celebrated piece of the pan. The Electricity Building was both an educational display and a house of transformers. We are to believe that it was designed by the pair of Green and Wicks, full of electrical innovations that include the brand new X-ray, included a demonstration of electric cars, the ambulance that carried McKinley, and various transmitters set up with speakers inside the Cave of Winds and a phone headset apparatus that attendees would put up to their ears and hear the Cave of Winds. William Sidney Wicks partnered with E.B. Green. Together, they are responsible, we are told, for the construction of the Albert Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, the Buffalo YMCA, Kibler High School, the First Presbyterian Church in Buffalo, Buffalo Savings Bank, the 20th Century Club, Tonawand Music Building, the Dayton Art Institute, and the Ontario Power Company on the Canadian side of the falls. Mr. Wicks, in addition, is responsible, we are told, for the Toledo Art Museum, Toledo, Ohio, the Agriculture Building at Cornell, the New City Hospital in Buffalo, and the Buffalo Chamber of Commerce. Half of the north wall of the Electricity Building were transformers, where the dangerous 11,000 volts coming in directly from Niagara Falls was converted into a safe 1,800 volts. The Ethnology Building was the second most popular attraction, engaging 75% of the attendees. We are to believe that this was constructed George Carey, who was the grandson of New York State Senator and U.S. Congressman Dr. Walter Carey, a student of Harvard and Columbia, Skull and Bones Mason. He was the first Buffaloian to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And his first work was for, now for some of you this name will be familiar, McKim, Mead, and White, the architectural firm in New York City that was the first place of employment for Carrere and Hastings. Richardson, the ultimate reset architect of them all, the big boy from New Orleans, and White, the pedophile. If you want to know more about that, watch my video about Carrere and Hastings. Collaborated, we are said, on the New York Insane Asylum in Buffalo. Andrew Zaburn III, I'm talking to you. Richardson and White, the pedophile, are said to have collaborated on the New York Insane Asylum in Buffalo. He married the daughter of Mr. Burge of the Wallpaper Empire in Buffalo, Burge, who also sat on the board of directors. His daughter was also in the legacy of Pierce Aereo cars, and he is said to have designed the Pierce Aereo Motor Company Administration Building on Elmwood Street and their museum. In addition to that, he is attributed, we are to believe, with construction of Buffalo General Hospital and the general architecture and layout of Forest Lawn Cemetery on Delaware Avenue. The United States Government Building is said to have been constructed by James Knox Taylor, who was a supervising architect for the Department of the Treasury from 1897 to 1912. This is something that I go into in some depth with earlier reset architect video. He is the key influence behind the passage of the Tarsney Act of 1893, which allowed for a public competition to be held among private architects for federal commissions. Before that, we are to believe that government buildings, state buildings, post offices, courthouses, and the like were built by commission. I'll let you decide what you think about all that. Of course, I believe that the buildings were here, and any architects that were brought in simply made them manageable, shall we say. Unfortunately, this bill was repealed after, under his watch, Mr. Taylor, he appointed a colleague who committed graft. Under his appointment, Mr. Taylor, among other things, is noted with constructing the San Francisco Court of Appeals and the Customs House in San Francisco, the courthouse in Baltimore, the Ellis Island Hospital, the old post office in Buffalo, the Tampa courthouse, the Niagara Old Post Office. And he died here in my lovely state of Florida, in Tampa. The Mines, Machinery, and Transportation Building, we are to believe, was designed and constructed by Robert Swain Peabody, who was the president of the American Institute of Architects from 1900 to 1901. So he was the big shot for the Institute during the construction and during the fair. He was also president for a time of the Boston École des Beaux-Arts Society, attributed with building many Carnegie homes across the country, with the New York Mutual Life Insurance Building in Boston, with the Boston and Providence Railway Depot, along with Grayfield and Stafford Place on Cumberland Island in Georgia, which was a Carnegie plantation estate. And if you haven't been to Cumberland Island, I suggest you go. It is a primitive site. It is a national park. The Carnegies had homes there. One of Andrew Carnegie's sons built quite a home there that has fallen into ruin. Of course, we're not sure who built it. If you look at it, the masonry would lead you to believe that it was already there. But it was a working plantation at the time, and they brought in mules and horses. And when they left the mules and horses behind. So while you're exploring this primitive place where there is nothing to be purchased, no bathrooms, no garbage cans, it's just primitive, beautiful, lush land, horses and mules run wild. Beautiful place. Absolutely beautiful. There was a service building that is to have been built, we are to believe, by Eisenfolt and Johnson. Now, there was a stadium there as well, and we are to believe that that was constructed by Babb, Cook, and Willard. And its purpose was displaying hundreds of farm implements. John Philip Sousa gave performances every day, more than once, throughout the park. He never once performed in the stadium. My friend Andrew Zabrun III tells me, because he knows Buffalo quite well from his childhood, that parts of the stadium still exist. Isn't that interesting? George Fletcher Babb, Walter Cook, and Daniel Willard. Mr. Cook attended Harvard, Skull and Bones, and then the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. These three gentlemen are attributed with constructing the Carnegie Museum in New York City, the New York Mutual Life Insurance Building in Montreal, 6 of the 39 Carnegie libraries, and yet none of them ever built a stadium or an amphitheater or anything like that. But we are to believe that they built this grand Athenian amphitheater. So the most infamous construction was the Temple of Music, constructed by Eisenfolt and Johnson, the place, unfortunately, where President McKinley was shot. The spot where he was shot is said to still be marked by a large stone marker on the traffic island dividing Fordham Road near Lincoln Road. The dome for the Temple of Music rose 180 feet. The hall could seat well over 2,000 people. It was painted in yellow with gold and red trim. Panels of the dome lit in blue light. The largest pipe organ ever built in the United States, the Temple of Music, it's still stop right there, Tartaria 101. If there is a dome with an organ, we're dealing with something else. But this pipe organ was said to have been constructed by pipe organ builder Emmons Howard. Now from here we have two stories. One story, Wiki, tells us that the organ was moved to the St. Louis Roman Catholic Church in Buffalo, but also notes, if you go to that website, that the organ was a 1903. The other story is that the organ was disassembled and moved to the Elmwood Music Hall, which is presently the Klein House Music Hall, where it stood in use until 1938. Then, for a variety of reasons, it was disassembled and moved into general storage. That was not like general storage is today, climate controlled, and that it deteriorated over time. The owner of the storage wanted it gone, and in May of 1942 sold the remains to salvage for $165. The largest pipe organ that had been or ever has been, we're told, built in the United States, was sold for salvage in 1942 for $165. Now, my friend Andrew mentioned to me that the stained glass covering the dome of the Temple of Music was supposed to have been moved to what is now the J.N. Adams Memorial Hospital in Perrysburg, New York, which was a sanitarium and is now closed. Andrew showed me photographs on Google Earth. It's not the same. Wikipedia confirmed that this is simply a popular melodramatic rumor, and that if you look at the old photographs and look at the Adams building, you can see that that's clearly not true. Auguste Eisenfolt was born in Germany. James Johnson, his partner, was from Buffalo. They are said to have constructed, in their practice, the Buffalo History Museum, Lafayette High School, the Calumet Building, the Iroquois Hotel, and the Niagara Mohawk Hotel, amongst other things. We had a women's building. Remember, this was the time of the suffragettes. We don't have an architect listed because apparently it was already there. It was part of the Buffalo Country Club of Golf and Polo, came to be known as the 20th Century Club. And at the time, Kate Hollum was the president of the Board of Women Managers, but it was Evelyn Rumsey. She was the daughter of suffragist artist who designed the poster for the convention that was sold throughout the park. Evelyn herself designed the logo. It was Rumsey land that was leased for the fair. Nothing like keeping it in the family. Carrie and Rumsey. As a part of the suffragette movement at the time, there was the Organization of Women Managers, as it was called, each major city having a chapter. This building was used as a gathering place for women of other chapters, where there were pamphlets, books, presentations. It was a meeting place for all women, but especially from the Women Managers of America, where women could rest in private, discuss political things like suffrage. There was no landscape noted in the park, but the boundary on Delaware Park was indeed designed by the shill Frederick Law Olmsted, famous for the White City, the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, Central Park, and the city of my childhood, San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, to name a few. He was still alive, and he would not allow any alteration to his park. But he did allow his park to be an entry to the fair, believing that his beautiful landscaping would help ground the visitors after the stimulation. Mr. Olmsted died 2 years later. They all died so quickly. Mr. Carey didn't have his hand in enough projects as it was. No, he is accredited with constructing and designing 3 other hallmarks to the fair, that being the Triumphal Bridge of Entry over Mirror Lake, the Profili Colonnade, and the Court of Fountains. Each pylon from the Triumphal Bridge was 40 by 50 feet, each standing 149 feet tall, all torn down and all canals filled because Mr. Rumsfeld wanted his land back. I think this was all already on Mr. Rumsfeld's land, and he got it cleared away. Other buildings and concessions included the Art Gallery, Baker's Chocolate Concession, various flower beds, the Graphic Arts Exhibition, Loney's Chocolate, a company from Buffalo, the Life-Saving Exhibit, which could be used as triage, but was also an educational exhibit for people who might suffer from heat stroke or blisters or things like that. The Mission Building, which was a religious propaganda, and U.S. government buildings. U.S. government buildings. Represented were Alaska, Canada, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, New England, and Puerto Rico, as well as New York, the home state. This, too, is attributed to Mr. Carey, the one fully standing extant building. It's now the Buffalo Historical Museum. In total, there were 150 buildings on the grounds of the Pan American Fair, all ultimately standing under the approving or disapproving pen of John Carrere. An interesting exhibition was Fair Japan, built entirely of bamboo. No screws, bolts, or nails. It included a tea garden with geisha, where individuals could sit and purchase tea. Groups of Japanese musicians and dancers moved about the park. There were rickshaw rides available for $1 an hour, though there were many complaints of the rickshaw drivers having Caucasian features. For the most part, the Japanese fair was the work of Kushabiki Yumina, and I apologize if I said that incorrectly. He had a similar exhibition at the White City in Chicago. He collaborated with fellow Japanese national Ari Saburo in subsequent years to build many more villages at many more fairs, including Luna Park at Coney Island and the Pan Pacific in San Francisco at 1915. There were intricate shrubs all over the Japanese fair, cut into a topiary, so shaped like animals. Acrobats, jugglers, tightrope walkers, and traditional music played. It is estimated that Mr. Yumina earned $111,000 at the close of the fair. There was an emergency hospital under the supervisorial watch of Dr. Roswell Park, MD, supervisor but rarely on site. In addition to the life-saving exhibit, the emergency hospital was designed primarily to go hand in hand with the infant incubator exhibition made famous by Dr. Martin Cornet, who I have done an earlier video on. This emergency hospital was staffed and equipped essentially for babies and pregnant or newly postpartum mothers. The doctors that were on staff, along with the nurses that were on staff on a daily, hourly basis, were OBGYN trained, and that was their experience as well. There was no surgical facility in the emergency hospital. This is the hospital where President McKinley was taken for emergency surgery after his shooting. They had to pull tables together into a room that was not lit by electric light to dig for the bullets. Interestingly, there was another building known as the Acetylene Building, a marvel of technology. Acetylene, most of us today will know as the colorless gas of acetylene welding torches. Apparently, it was discovered by Edmund Davy in 1839. It is the hottest gas for cutting when blended with oxygen. Oxyacetylene can reach degrees of 3,000 to 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At the time, it was in carbide lamps, mining headlights, and streetlights. It was considered, indeed, a marvel. But due to its combustibility, it was replaced by incandescent light as soon as that was designed. It's still used. It can be hydrolyzed into plastics, into acrylic fibers, polyethylene, paints, resins, and polymers. As I mentioned before, Mr. Cunet's infantorium. Mr. Cunet was very unhappy with his placement on the Midway instead of in the educational regions. His concession, along with all the concessions on the Midway, cost 25 cents, which is about $7.50 in modern money. That on top of 50-cent admission to the fair, which is about $18. The nurses that attended the babies lived upstairs in the second-story building. The incubators that had been purchased for the fair were sold to the Children's Hospital after the fair. The doctors held their residence in the emergency hospital. Dr. Cunet, who was not a doctor in America, he was born in Poland and never re-secured his doctor status here. So is doctor in name only. Made $25,000 at the end of the fair. That translates into $700,000 today. There were 21 acres of Midway and over 2,000 applications from the entire globe for concessions. Concession director Frederick Taylor hoped to profit $2 million after discussing profits with White City exhibitor Gaston Acun, who owned the lovely Orient exhibition, who claims to have made $600,000 at the end of the White City, $17 million in today's money. The beautiful Orient exhibition included, in addition to Asian cultures as we know, Algerians, Tunisians, Turks, and Nubians. I am somewhat confused by that. They had dancers, various performances, lots of costumes, and the likes. I should add that there was a Philippine exhibit as well, but due to Philippine being a new territory after the Spanish-American War, they had their very own exhibit. A very popular place was the Pabst concession. Pabst Blue Ribbon. Big, beautiful, very popular. They were working the beer is food angle, that distilled beverages full of B vitamins and yeast were safer than tap water at the time, and maybe it was. A Buffalo institution, Larkin Soap. Larkin Soap, Andrew Zabrun III. Larkin Soap. We should talk about this alone at another time. Andrew Zabrun can tell you many things about the Larkin Soap Company and Frank Lloyd Wright and the Buffalo connection, but I'll leave that for him. Roy Croft was the founder and owner of Larkin Soap. In addition, there were log huts with 6 Indian tribes that included Geronimo and Buffalo Bill. There was a U.S. Mint exhibit, which just was a small building, that had the first coin souvenir machine. So you are familiar with going to various types of locations and you insert a penny into a device that will press the penny with an embossing of the logo for the city or attraction you are visiting. Apparently, the first time that was used was at the Pan. There was a miniature railroad that ran all over the park. When the park closed and the salvage began, one of the engines was taken to Braddock Farm, Maryland. The first gentleman to single-handedly sail across the world was named Joshua Slocum. And apparently his sailboat, which was a sloop named Spray, was on display as well. Other concessions included House Upside Down, Land of the Midnight Sun, Darkness and Dawn, and the aforementioned Old Plantation, which I won't even discuss. A popular and noteworthy attraction was Missionary Ridge, which was one of the 2 cycloramas there, both owned by E. W. McConnell. Missionary Ridge was a rendition of the Civil War battle of the same name from 1863. Cycloramas are round buildings. There were 360 degrees of murals with potted plants placed around strategically to create a 3D effect. 60 feet tall, 300 feet long. There were actors in attire reenacting and telling stories. How morbid. The Civil War was not that long ago. The other cyclorama was the Kilauea Volcano, that again had murals, plants, and installations, and used recorded sound through speakers to give the effect and the horror of an eruption. The Aereo cycle, the giant seesaw, also very popular. An early variation on the Ferris wheel. This attraction was owned by Fred Thompson and Skip Dunny. Like all other attractions, admission was 25 cents, so $7.50 on top of the 50 cents, $18 to get into the fair. The Aereo cycle was 140 feet tall, 240 feet long, and when you were in the top car on the top of the ride, you would have been 275 feet off the ground. There were 2 wheels, each 40 feet wide, with cars carrying 18 passengers each that were 10 feet long. The ride was powered by a 40 horsepower generator. Each wheel having a 14-horsepower motor. The Aereo cycle was illuminated by 2,000 electric bulbs. The ride was 10 minutes long. The Johnstown flood. More morbidity. Albert Swift and Randolph McNutt owned the Jonestown flood attraction. Commemorating, celebrating, making money off of the 1889 disaster, where a dam broke in Johnston, Pennsylvania, and 2,200 lives were tragically lost. The building was 140 feet long, 100 feet wide. There was a show every 30 minutes. There were painted scenes, installations and plants, speakers with rushing water, and apparently water was piped in as well. Mr. Swift and McNutt walked away with $60,000 in profits, which is about $1,700,000 in today's money. There was a miniature farm with a dairy exhibit, the Nebraska Sod House, a trip to the moon ride, which after the fair was sold to Looney Park at Coney Island, a 9-ton elephant, and a chimp who ate with a knife and fork. There were exhibits and concessions that were denied. Here are a few of those. The Rainbow City installation was to be a suspended steel apparatus that went from one side of the park to another, covered in balloons, creating a rainbow over the Rainbow City. Caverns of Hell was a religious exhibition petitioned to be in the educational portion, which was to have visions of hell. A barbershop was turned down, understandably, from all the other barbershops in the community. Robin Hood's barn came with the State House of Ohio. They wanted to sell Buckeye trees, Ohio Buckeyes. Illinois House wanted to bring along an exhibition for the world's largest hog. They were turned down, along with the exhibition for the four-legged chicken, and perhaps most favorably, the Freaks exhibit was also denied by the board of directors. William McKinley was elected President of the United States in 1896, during the height of the Depression from the panic of 1893 and the runs on the bank. He defeated Democrat William Jennings Bryan. The Spanish-American War resulted in prosperity returning by 1898 with the acquisition of the territories Puerto Rico and the Philippines, which each had their own exhibit. At the fair, each brought in Puerto Rican and Philippine nationals. He was reelected in 1900. His original vice president died, so he promoted his then Secretary of the Navy, you know who, Teddy Roosevelt. Leon Sholgus was born in Detroit in 1873 to Polish immigrants. Leon lost his factory job in 1893 after a labor dispute. He worked irregularly after this time and was pulled in by many, as many were during that time, into meetings for the Anarchy Party. He soon identified himself as an anarchist. This was not very good on Leon. It tore up his nerves, and he had to give up his own accommodations and move back in with his parents because he was suffering nervous breakdowns and couldn't hold a job. He attended a speech by the famous, infamous Emma Goldman and was captured collected her pamphlets, joined with the people she suggested, and at one point actually took the train to Chicago to visit her and learn more about her and her anarchy. She was going to the Buffalo World's Fair, it so happens, during his time and visit, and so they rode to the train station together, we are to believe, for Buffalo. President McKinley was looking forward to shaking hands with the public at the Hall of Music, where it was announced he would be attending. Yet those around him in his cabinet were very concerned about his lack of interest in any security and in publicly stating his path at the fair, especially since Lincoln and Garfield had both been assassinated in public. On September 3rd, Sholgus purchased a .32 caliber Johnson Ivor revolver at a hardware store in Buffalo. Gosh, I can't buy a gun at a hardware store. I haven't bought any of my guns at a hardware store. Anyway, on September 6th, Sholgus shot President McKinley in a public handshaking gathering at the Temple of Music. The electrical ambulance carried President McKinley through the park from the Hall of Music to the emergency hospital. The supervising doctor was not on site, as he often wasn't. He was at a hospital in Buffalo performing surgery at the time. The doctor who was supervising the emergency hospital, Dr. Matthew D. Mann, was an OB-GYN with no gunshot experience. Nor did any of the nurses who worked at Dr. Cooney's infant exhibition have any gunshot experience or surgical experience. There was no electricity in the room set up for the surgery. They had to move tables together to do this work, as the emergency hospital was designed for infants. The story goes that cooking pans were used to reflect light into the room from outdoors. Dr. Mann found one bullet and removed it. He found evidence that the other bullet was lodged a bit too close to the spine. His lack of experience prevented him from looking any further. Concerns arose at the time to use the brand new X-ray machine, which was on display in the Electricity Building, but the owner of the X-ray machine refused to allow it to be used because there was no history of use. There was no potential side effects. He did not want the President of the United States to be the first guinea pig to use his new machine. When the supervising doctor for the emergency hospital returned from surgery the next day, he agreed that the use of the X-ray machine was a bad idea and confirmed that the bullet was lodged near his spine and that surgery was far too dangerous. McKinley was returned via electric ambulance to President Milburn's home, where he died of gangrene on September 14th. The murder trial began on September 23rd. The jury was made of doctors who had treated McKinley over his stay, along with eyewitnesses of the shooting. Defense attorney, state attorney Lauren L. Lewis did not call a single witness. It was a 2-day trial. The jury deliberated for 30 minutes. Leon met his death in the electric chair on October 29th. Acid was poured into his casket over his corpse to dissolve his remains, and he was buried in the prison graveyard. Congressional legislation was an immediate result of this, creating Secret Service detail to protect the president henceforth. The new telegraphs that were on display in the electrical buildings around the fair were transmitting news of McKinley's shooting in less than an hour after it happened to newspapers across the United States. Anti-anarchy laws were also a resultant of the shooting, deporting all non-citizens who were in any way suspected of instigating anarchist action, including Emma Goldman. This shooting was also a shot to the fair. People were slow to attend after. Adding to that, weather became very irregular. Massive, rainy, cold, windy storms hit Buffalo. When the fair closed, they were far under their projected income. The fair had cost $10 million. They made $7 million. 8,120 bodies passed through the gates. 5,307 of those paid attendance. The committee lost $3 million. The day before McKinley's shooting, 30,000 people came through the gates after 6 p.m. You can see that the shooting made a huge impact. Mr. Rumsey, who owned the land most of the fair was on, had insisted that all be cleared, demoed, and his land return to the family property for family use after. So the demo had to begin as soon as possible. The contents of the fair was sold to the winning bid, the Chicago House Wrecking Company, for $92,000. That's about $3 million today. The fair closed in November. Demos began in March. The public lobbied for permission to save the electrical tower, but couldn't raise the $30,000, which is close to $1 million today, by the demo date. And the statue atop the electric tower, perhaps the most famous statue in the park, the Goddess of Light, the 12-foot-tall Goddess of Light, was also lobbied for protection. A buyer placed a down payment, but at the last day, never came forth in form or in money. So the original electrical tower was destroyed in 1902, but a replica was built in 1923? What sense does that make? The contract called for the demolition to occur within 150 days. Salvage began immediately, focusing on lumber in the smaller buildings. People came to watch in droves, but so did raiders, looters, glass breakers. So a fence was built around the fair in December. On March 17th, the park commissioners petitioned the Buffalo Board of Aldermen, which is like the city council, for $318,000 to restore damages to Delaware Park that has occurred through the duration of the fair. Remember, Delaware Park was designed by Olmsted, not as part of the park, but an entry and or exit to the park. Many people were moving through it, and there was a great deal of damage done. Hard demolition began on the 5th of March, 1902. In May of 1902, a catalog was produced of the salvageable artifacts up for auction. Pan American President John Milburn, who owned the home in which McKinley passed, successfully lobbied Congress in passing the Pan American Relief Bill to compensate the creditors and bondholders for the $3 million loss. On August 2nd, Amherst Street was returned to public right-of-way. On August 9th, employee Bert Moran of the demolition company fell to his death from the top of the electrical tower while preparing it for demolition. The last demolition was of the Temple of Music. And sadly, Just a few years later, in 1909, the S.E. Nye Corporation began development of Nye Park residential community on the old Rumsey property where the fair had been. So what do you think of all of that? Do you think those gentlemen actually built those buildings? What about the unusual combinations of marriages? As always, I will let you draw your own conclusions. And thank you for joining me once again for a long Medusa Was Framed video. I plan to dissect this in great detail with my good friend Andrew Zabroon III, whose channel is Andrew Zabroon III on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute, and many other platforms. Thank you, Andrew. I look forward to looking into this further with you and engaging in your first-hand knowledge of what the folks in Buffalo have to say about this fair and what you know about the land that remains. I am very grateful to all of you for your comments, the coffees you buy me, your emails. Thank you. Thank you, one and all. This is Joyce at Medusa Was Framed, signing out.